Pay close attention to the spellbinding emotional set pieces and character psychology of Rings of Power, and you will notice a depth to the series that may not be apparent on first viewing. In particular, the layered characterization of Galadriel. With this most complete of screen villains, the show makes reference to other infamous villains, both real and fictional. The first major hint in the show of Galadriel as an unrelenting antagonist comes during the opening narration. She is seen placing the helmet of a fallen elf warrior on top of a giant pile of helmets. This is a foreshadowing of Galadriel's role as the story's dark figure, a force of murderous destruction that will drive the narrative forward in a fanatical quest for blood. The helmets obviously symbolise the countless victims that will perish in Galadriel's genocide. Her placing the helmet onto the pile herself and gazing on it in a manner reminiscent of a serial killer admiring a trophy is an early indication of Psychopath Galadriel, which is a central aspect of Galadriel's character in Rings of Power. The creators of the show could have chosen to show Galadriel mourning the fallen elf warriors in a graveyard, or show her looking out over a battlefield of corpses. Instead, they have chosen a very specific image of Galadriel standing over a pile of helmets, which obviously symbolise human heads. This image conjures association with the pyramids of human heads piled up by the Mongols during their conquests, and of course of modern day serial killers who collected human remains as trophies, perhaps the most famous example being Jeffrey Dahmer, who collected human skulls. The opening narration is not yet finished, and already Galadriel has been symbolically linked to genocide and murder. Another instance of subconscious symbolism being used to depict Galadriel as possessing a serial killer psychology can be seen when she is riding her horse on the beach. The first time we see Galadriel express an emotion that could be described as joy. This is initially confusing since up until now, Galadriel has been a ruthless psychopath, incapable of even basic emotion. Prior to this, there has been only one instance when Galadriel even smiles.
Look at you now. Commander of the Northern Armies, warrior of the Wastelands.
The only time she expressed happiness so far is when Elrond refers to her role in the genocide of the orcs. Clearly, she takes pride in her genocidal work. But more importantly, this exchange shows us that the only thing that Galadriel really cares about, the only thing that can animate her dark spirit, is death. While in the scene with Elrond, Galadriel gave only a brief smile. In the beach scene, she seems to be in the throes of ecstasy. The reason for this is revealed in a later episode in which Galadriel rushes into battle on horseback, drawing her sword long before battle is joined, in eager anticipation of blood. In the battle that follows, we see Galadriel butchering her way through an enemy force. She even makes a game of it, severing an orc while hanging upside down. Now we understand the raw, unbridled elation Galadriel feels when she rides the horse on the beach. Riding a horse at speed reminds Galadriel of the slaughter she has committed in battle. Here, Galadriel is experiencing what psychological scientists refer to as homicidal ideation, more commonly known as murder fantasy. While riding on horseback, she is flooded with the same emotions she has experienced in the past when killing. We see a parallel here with real-life serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. In a recent television series dramatizing Dahmer's murders, one scene shows Dahmer sexually gratifying himself in public in response to sexual arousal brought on by a sudden fantasy of his first victim. Notice that in the Dahmer scene and the Galadriel scene, the same expression, what could quite accurately be described as unguarded joy, is present on the face of the show's villain, and that prior to these scenes, both shows have been very careful to show only trace elements of any emotion that could even be interpreted as happiness. The parallel with Dahmer also suggests that Galadriel's homicidal ideation elicits in her feelings of psychosexual gratification. In this scene, we perceive, at least on a subconscious level, that Galadriel is experiencing strong sexual arousal, which contrasts sharply with her behaviour up to this point. When Galadriel looks at a man, she does so with an expression that communicates mild curiosity at best, but usually total indifference. Morfydd Clark does a superb job acting out these subtle but important facial expressions, which, when taken together, communicate the erotophonophilia that is an integral part of Galadriel's psychopathy. There is one more possible hint that the creators of the Galadriel character were influenced by Jeffrey Dahmer, a scene in which she confesses the compulsion to engage in merciless butchery to Halbrand, soon to be Sauron the Great.
Why do you keep fighting?
Because I cannot stop.
This may be a reference to Dahmer's own psychopathic behaviour being driven by an overwhelming compulsion, but it could also be a more general indication that Galadriel, like many other serial killers, is driven by a compulsive need to commit murder rather than merely a desire to do so, though in Galadriel's case, both compulsion and desire are present. Galadriel's affinity for horses may also be a subtle but important link to an infamous Nazi villain, Amon Goeth. While at first this interpretation may seem far-fetched, it makes perfect sense when viewed within the context of the very clear and obvious references Rings of Power makes to the film in which Goeth is brilliantly depicted by Ralph Fiennes, Schindler's List. The creators of the demon Galadriel very clearly want to communicate the parallels between Galadriel's war of annihilation against the Uruk people and the Nazi attempt to exterminate the Jews. The final solution. The parallel is clearest in one scene in particular, which carefully mirrors a famous scene from Schindler's List, and in which Galadriel directly takes on the role of Goeth himself. This is the scene in which Galadriel interrogates the freedom fighter, Adar, who she has run down and captured following her defeat of his army. In this scene, Galadriel questions Adar, threatens him, expresses her belief that he and his race are not people, expresses her desire to utterly exterminate his race, threatens him, flies into a rage, and injures him. This scene is a direct reference to, and in many ways a mirror of the infamous scene in Schindler's List, in which Goeth torments Helen Hirsch, his Jewish housemaid. The Galadriel Adar scene employs many of the same thematic and dramatic beats, and contains dialogue written specifically to communicate Galadriel's proto-Nazi ideology, and to show the psychological similarities between Goeth and Galadriel. Notice that both scenes take place in a small enclosed room, with the tormentor towering over the victim. Goeth's victim, Helen, is much smaller than him, so his physical and psychological dominance over her could still be communicated with her standing. Adar is taller than Galadriel, so in the Rings of Power scene, he is lying on the floor in order to ensure that Galadriel's utter dominance of the situation and the threat she poses to Adar is clearly communicated, as well as to maintain the visual parallel with the Schindler's List scene. In addition, in both scenes, the antagonist starts out on the left side of the shot with the victim on the right, facing the tormentor. Let's have another look at the Rings of Power scene beats, but this time with the Schindler's List scene. It starts out peacefully, with the tormentor in both scenes keeping a polite distance.
So, this is where you come to hide from me.
You are one of them. Are you not? The Moriondor.
As the scene progresses, the tormentor gets closer.
Even Moriondor take orders from the master, and I seek yours.
Galadriel expresses her racial views on Uruks.
Tortured, twisted, made into a new and ruined form of life.
Similar to how Goeth expresses his views on Jews.
And they compare you to vermin and to rodents and to lice.
Goeth indicates that he believes Jews are not people.
And I realize that you're not a person in the strictest sense of the word, but...
Galadriel asserts that the Uruk are not people.
Your kind was a mistake, made in mockery.
Goeth makes reference to the racial views of Nazism, but is also forced to face the reality of Helen's humanity.
Is this the face of a rat? Are these the eyes of a rat? Hath not a Jew eyes?
Like Goeth with the Jews, Galadriel is made to consider the idea that the Uruk people are not vermin to be exterminated, that they are sentient beings who have as much right to life as she.
Each one has a name. A heart.
A heart created by mockery.
We are creations of the one, master of the secret fire, the same as you, is worthy of the breath of life.
An idea which, like Goeth, she ultimately rejects.
And the scourge of your kind ends with you.
Both villains refuse to see the despised race as people, but both are forced to consider the possibility that their genocidal racism is wrong, and that the race they seek to annihilate are in fact people. Both Galadriel and Goeth accuse their victim of deceit.
I do not believe you.
You nearly talked me into it.
Both villains insult their victim with a racial slur.
You're a Jewish bitch.
You slavering
And at the end of both scenes, the psychopathic tormentor flies into a rage and attacks the victim.
Galadriel!
In both scenes, blood is visibly drawn from the victim, enough to impress upon the viewer the need for the tormentor to satisfy a thirst for violence, but not enough to be gratuitous or life-threatening. Notice also the attention to detail of the writers, mirroring the scene as closely as possible at times. The insults spat at the victim by the tormentor even parallel one another grammatically.
You're a Jewish bitch.
You slithering.
And the use of the word you here, you slithering orc, you Jewish bitch, emphasizes the personal hatred that the tormentor feels toward the victim, as well as the tormentor's determination to establish psychological dominance, a subtle but important detail. In both scenes, the victim is left in no doubt as to the long-term intentions of the tormentor.
One day, he will shoot me.
One day, before I drive my dagger into your poisoned heart, I will whisper in your piked ear that all your offspring are dead.
Galadriel has a dark monologue in which she expresses her determination to exterminate the Uruk people.
Your kind was a mistake, made in mockery. And even if it takes me all of this age, I vow to eradicate every last one of you.
Galadriel is here expressing in clear and direct terms what is continually insinuated in Schindler's List.
God forbid you ever get a real taste for Jewish skirt. There's no future in it. They don't have a future. That's not just good old-fashioned Jew-hating talk. It's policy now.
But Galadriel is not so subtle.
I vow to eradicate every last one of you.
While the Nazi in her wants a final solution to the Uruk problem, the psychopath in her wants to shout her deep hatred of this people out loud and to brag openly about what she will do to them. Again, we see parallels with Aemon Gut.
Is that why they fear us?
We have the fucking power to kill, that's why they fear us.
I vow to eradicate every last one of you.
This is a truly brilliant example of the Rings of Power creators communicating important aspect of the Galadriel beast's genocidal vision, as well as the nature of the diseased mind which harbours it. As well as the scene parallel, there are general similarities between Galadriel and Gut. In both Schindler's List and Rings of Power, the central villain commits summary murder publicly as a means of impressing upon their underlings the brutality that is expected of them. But importantly, these villains are not simply a crude, blunt tool. Fear is their main weapon. Adar talks to Galadriel not because she uses physical violence to extract information from him, but because she threatens to torture his kinsmen painfully to death.
Perhaps we should bring our prisoners into the sunlight.
Helen meekly serves Gut not because he beats her, but because he has instilled in her a deep animal fear.
You can answer. But what's the right answer? That's what you're thinking. What does he want to hear?
Both Galadriel and Gut view the individual members of the race they despise as having no value outside of the labour that can be extracted from them. Gut believes that any Jew not justifying his or her continued existence by working must be executed immediately. Galadriel likewise cannot conceive of the idea that an Uruk can have any value outside of the labour it provides, even when presented with evidence to the contrary.
My children have no master.
They are not children, they are slaves.
As is the case with Gut, ideology has overridden her rational thought. Both Galadriel and Gut use collective punishment as a means of instilling fear and cooperation.
Gerd lined up everybody from the missing command's barracks. He shot the man to the left of Bieski, the man to the right of him.
Perhaps we should bring our prisoners into the sunlight.
It is also possible that parallels are drawn between Galadriel and the infamous Nazi Reinhard Heydrich, who has been described as the architect of the Holocaust, and who, following his brutal crackdown against the Czech resistance, was nicknamed the Blonde Beast. Galadriel is a striking blonde. Her character is heavily associated with Nazism on both a conscious and subconscious level, and she even has a nickname of her own, which she has earned through her ruthless pursuit and slaughter of the orcs.
Galadriel! The Galadriel!
Scourge of the Orcs.
While the writers may not be deliberately trying to create a direct link between Galadriel and Heidrek, as they did between Galadriel and Goethe, the blonde beast persona is nonetheless an interesting aspect of Galadriel's character. The Nazis are the closest thing to pure evil to have emerged in human history, and popular culture has strongly imprinted the association between Nazism and evil in the collective consciousness. So by creating an association between Galadriel and Nazism, a clearer picture is built up of Galadriel as the nightmare that lives. There is also one other brief scene parallel between Rings of Power and Schindler's List, which serves to further emphasize Galadriel's role as the supreme evil. In Schindler's List, one of the last scenes shows Schindler addressing the Jews he saved from the Holocaust. He stands before them, towering over them as a savior figure, the light pouring from the massive windows behind him onto the faces of the saved, assembled together in this place of refuge and safety. In Rings of Power, this scene is paralleled by the brief scene which shows the hero, Sauron, towering before the orcs he has saved from the genocidal designs of the demon Galadriel. The light pouring onto them from the large cave mouth behind him, these last of a persecuted people looking up to their savior, who has led them in an odyssey of escape from extermination. Another interesting parallel between Schindler and Sauron is that both could have made themselves rich as war profiteers, but instead chose to save a hunted people and impoverish themselves in the process. Schindler is a highly skilled and experienced industrialist. He could have produced shells for the Reich military, but sabotages his own machines so that he will not contribute to the slaughter. Sauron is shown to be a highly skilled smith. He could easily have forged weapons for the conquering armies of the elves, enriching himself in the process. Instead, he, like Schindler, chose to be a savior rather than the blacksmith of death. The Sauron cave scene is a direct mirror image of the Schindler scene. Just as the Galadriel Goethe scene is designed to show the villain Galadriel as the moral equivalent of Nazism itself, the mirroring of Sauron Moses to Schindler emphasizes his heroism and his role in standing against the Leviathan that would plunge Middle-earth into darkness. There is also a strong demonic presence in Galadriel. There are constant hints throughout the show of Galadriel as a satanic being, and her demonism is confirmed in the final episode. An early hint of Galadriel's demonic character is when she declares,
"There is a tempest in me."
This is a very unusual and specific choice of words. Although we today understand sea storms to be climatic events, the peoples of Tolkien's world would have understood them as supernatural events, as our own ancestors did. When Galadriel makes reference to a tempest in herself, she is making reference to this dark demonic force that dwells within her, compelling her to bring into being the living nightmare she seeks to create by plunging her world into endless war. In the season climax, Demon Galadriel is referenced in physical form when she transforms from her human form, the beautiful, beguiling exterior, to her interior monster form, the demonic, blood-ravenous blonde beast. In another example of how brilliantly directed and thought out Rings of Power is, the essentially metaphysical nature of Galadriel's evil, that is, her embodiment of evil itself, is here revealed. Galadriel is not an evil character in Rings of Power, she is simply evil itself, in its pure, unrefined form. Galadriel's role as the nexus of evil and man's dark nature is symbolized by the chunk of mithril, which refuses to bind with lesser metals.
The mithril is proud. It refuses every effort to bond it with lesser ores.
The mithril's refusal to alloy with lesser metals is symbolic of Galadriel's nature. Galadriel is pure evil. There is no good in her, and like the mithril, which refuses to mix with metals it considers beneath it, Galadriel refuses all attempts the world around her makes to bring good into her being. We see Galadriel's proud insistence upon evil when she refuses to turn back on her hunt for victims in the northern wastelands, instead marching her exhausted soldiers on in pursuit of blood. We see dismissal of the good when Elrond beseeches her to abandon the path of death and destruction that she has set herself on.
You have fought long enough, Galadriel. Put up your sword.
In response to this suggestion to live a more peaceful life, to practice good, Galadriel insults Elrond.
You have not seen what I have seen.
The obvious example of Galadriel refusing the penetration of light into the demonic chasm that resides in her in place of a soul is when she explodes into a rage at Sauron's suggestion of a political marriage between them as a basis for a long-term peace. Such a marriage would allow a powerful, if fragile, political alliance to take effective control of Middle-earth, In exchange for a recognized position of political authority, Sauron would give up his designs of defensive warfare against the elves, and Galadriel would abandon her campaign of extermination against the Uruk people. Sauron would work with Celebrimbor to create the rings, which would be an existential guarantee for the elves. This would be an excellent arrangement for all parties, and quite apart from the long-term benefits for the people of Middle-earth, it would be of great benefit to Galadriel, since she would gain a strong husband in Sauron and a kingdom of her own. However, in spite of all this, Galadriel not only refuses this proposal, but is enraged by it. The behemoth that inhabits her being rises to the surface. In response to Sauron's proposal of a marriage founded upon peace, but which may eventually blossom into love, Galadriel vows to kill Sauron.
You will die because of me!
This show has expertly included many subtle but repeated instances in which Galadriel refuses any invitation to good in order to communicate the otherworldly nature of her evil. She is not evil in the sense that a common murderer is evil. He may regret his crime, or at the very least, in his own mind, have excuses for it. But Demon Galadriel is an anthropomorphic character. She is the very embodiment of evil. In the Jackson trilogy, Sauron was depicted as a giant red burning eye, a symbol of the darkness that was spreading over Middle-earth. In Rings of Power, the showrunners have boldly chosen to make their representation of this darkness, Galadriel, a normal-looking human woman. A living force of demonic moral corruption, but contained within a beautiful vessel. This dichotomy of the beautiful exterior with the demonic interior is a far more complex, realistic, and ultimately compelling representation of evil. For when the devil appears in life, it is not in the form of a monster, but in the form of something that, at least at first, appears beautiful. When we first see Galadriel in the show, she is the very picture of purity and innocence, a golden child playing in a meadow. But by the end, the mask of humanity has slipped, and the audience sees Galadriel for what she truly is, the Antichrist. The Rings of Power visionaries wanted to create with Galadriel a demonic paragon, a being of truly supernatural moral depravity. In order to achieve this, they created psychological and symbolic elements that link Galadriel to infamous serial killers, Nazi war criminals, and indeed to Satan himself. Rings of Power's antagonist is much more than just another screen villain. She is the Luciferian ideal made flesh, the daughter of darkness, the mirror which reflects all evils that abide in man's heart. She is Galadriel. Thanks for listening, subscribe, and don't forget that there is a tempest in the like button.